Good evening. Certainly glad to have the opportunity to assemble together with you again this evening. I hope that you still have your bulletin from this morning. We'll pick another one up on your way in this evening, and we'll use the outline provided therein to help you follow along. As you can see on the screen now that it's warmed up there, you can see that the title of this evening's lesson is God Keeps His Promises. And of course that is something that I feel the need to talk about a lot. I think it's a very important concept for us to understand for a number of different reasons, and we'll talk about one of those reasons tonight. What you already know from your study of the Bible, and certainly if you've been following along in the reading that we've been doing through the Scriptures this year, you should have read well into the book of Joshua by now, or even into the book of Judges, if you're really keeping up with the reading. You already know then that long before the Israelites began to take possession of the promised land, the land of Canaan, which God had promised to give to Abraham's descendants way back in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 7. First time we see the promised land that God would give to his people. We know that even before they took possession of it, God had already given them, with that promise, a warning of what would befall them if they did not choose to obey him. In fact, in Leviticus chapter 26, to the generation of people that came out of Egypt before they ever even were given the opportunity to go into the promised land, we find in Leviticus chapter 26 a description of the blessings that God would give to his people if they were obedient. But we also see in that chapter a very vivid warning of the terrors, the terrible things that would come upon them if they chose to disobey God. And then, of course, that generation all perished in the wilderness and were not permitted to go into the land of promise. And so in the book of Deuteronomy, all those same concepts were repeated for that next generation, the generation that would go into the promised land and take possession of it. And we see this in Deuteronomy, in particular, chapter 27, 28, and 29. That's the passage where God said it to them, told them, when you go in there, stand on Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal and give the blessings and the curses that are a part of the law. You might also remember that specifically included in the punishments that the people of Israel would incur if they rejected God and worshipped idols instead would be that they would lose the right to live in the promised land and have that be their home. So what we see in this already is this simple concept that I think is very important for us to understand when we read the promises of God, whether they are to Israel or to us. And that is that God makes what I call conditional promises. What do I mean by conditional promises? Well, they're usually phrased this way. If you do this, then I will do that, right? So you all already understand this concept. If you've raised children, you've certainly employed this concept. The classic example I always give is, if you clean your room, I'll buy you some ice cream, right? That's an if-then. It's a conditional promise. If they clean their room, then they get the ice cream. But implied in that is the opposite, isn't it? If you don't clean your room, no ice cream, right? It's pretty clear, isn't it? And we understand that, and of course, using that in training up our children, we teach them to understand the idea of conditional promises. And that's good because, again, God makes conditional promises. We have the if and the then, but very clearly and stated out very plainly in all of God's promises that we've been talking about to the people of Israel thus far, is always the opposite as well. Right? It's implied when we say to our child, if you clean your room, I'll buy you some ice cream. The opposite is implied. God doesn't imply. He states it plainly. He states it very plainly. If you disobey, here are the consequences. Very plain, very clear. Hard to misunderstand. You almost have to try. And so that's what we see in these passages, that God is talking to the people of Israel, making these promises to them about this land that he was going to give them to be their home. It's a conditional promise. And he states very plainly both the positive, if they obey, and the negative, if they disobey. Very plainly, he states these things for them. He talks to them about the blessings for obedience and about the punishments that they would receive for their disobedience. And so this is why I so confidently say that God always keeps his promises, because he states both sides of the agreement. He doesn't, again, leave it to you assume, right? He states it very plainly. He tells them specifically, with the way that he expressed his promises, as to cover all the variables that he knew were in place because of the free will that he gave to mankind. And so he doesn't leave anything up to chance or assumption or ambiguity. He states it plainly. If you obey, here are the blessings. If you disobey, here are the consequences. He states it very, very plainly for them throughout these passages that I'm talking about and many others. And so that's what we see in the passage that we're going to focus our attention on tonight, which is Joshua chapter 23. Turn there with me if you would. Joshua chapter 23, this will be the passage that we will focus our attention on tonight. Here in Joshua chapter 23, we see this very principle, this conditional promises, this if-then sort of language stated very plainly in Joshua chapter 23. In this chapter, an aged Joshua is speaking to the people of Israel and reminding them of what God had already done for them in giving them the promised land, but he also reminds them of their obligation to God, the covenant that they were in, that required them to continue to follow the Lord's commands. And so that's what we're going to be focused on tonight, is this concept of conditional promises and the way that God always keeps his promises, as illustrated by Joshua chapter 23. So let's look at the beginning of Joshua chapter 23. Let's look at the words that we see Joshua speaking to the people of Israel as he talks to them first about their current conditions, the situation that they were then in as the followers of God. Let's read the first 4 verses of Joshua chapter 23. Joshua chapter 23, beginning in verse 1. Now it came about after many days, when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies on every side, and Joshua was old, advanced in years, that Joshua called for all Israel, for their elders, and for their heads, and for their judges, and for their officers, and said to them, I am old, advanced in years, and you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations because of you. For the Lord your God is he who has been fighting for you. See, I have apportioned to you these nations, which remain as an inheritance for your tribes, with all the nations which I have cut off, from the Jordan even to the great sea, toward the setting of the sun. And so as we look at this beginning portion of our chapter, what we see is this description that Joshua gives them of the state of the nation. Right? This is the State of the Union address here, right? Joshua says, okay, here we are. We've come into the promised land. We've managed to conquer most of it thus far with the help of God. God has allowed us to take possession of this land that he had promised to our ancestors, going all the way back to Abraham. And so here we are. God has given us great victory in battle. He's enabled us to defeat the vast majority of the Canaanite groups that were within the land. And God had given the land to them just as he had promised. So at this point, as it says in the first verse, there's peace. The major battles are over. Joshua has led them across the Jordan. They've conquered up and down throughout the land of Canaan, and they have taken possession, and he has divided the land up into the different tribal allotments. And what remnants of the pagan peoples that are still in the land, each individual tribe is now responsible for eradicating them out of their own inheritance. So that's the current situation for the people of Israel when Joshua is beginning this farewell address, as it's sometimes called, for the people of Israel here. But notice what Jared read a minute ago. So we've seen that God says the major battles are over. Joshua's telling them God has already given us this land. We've been victorious. God has ensured us to have this great victory. And yet there's still some fragments, some remnants, some strongholds of the Canaanite peoples that are still within the land. And you might say, well, why didn't God just get rid of them all right away? Well, as Jared read, it was never God's plan to get rid of them all the way at once. God had already told them before they ever came into the land that he was not going to drive out all of the Canaanite peoples at once. And he told them why. If you were listening to the passage that Jared read, God had already told them he wasn't going to do that in Exodus 23. It's repeated again for the next generation in Deuteronomy chapter 7. So they knew this was going to be the situation because God had already told them. The purpose for this was to be able to ensure that they would take possession of a fruitful land, not a land that had gone sort of wild on them, a land that was prepared for them by the former residents. There's other passages that talk about they're going to come into a land that's already got houses built and vineyards growing and orchards planted. They wouldn't have to do those things. They were already there. He was providing them a land that was perfectly prepared for them. And so if he had driven out all of the Canaanites before they ever got there, well, the land would have gone wild before they ever were able to take possession of it, and they would have basically had to start over. So he didn't drive them all out at once. Next, consider what God said that he would do for Israel next. So he's already done a lot. What's he going to do now? What's the future? Joshua's going to tell them what's going to happen next. Let's look at the passage starting in verse 5. Again, this is Joshua 23, beginning in verse 5. Joshua says, "The Lord your God, he will thrust them out from before you and drive them from before you, and you will possess their land just as the Lord your God promised you. Be very firm then to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, so that you may not turn aside from it to the right hand or to the left, so that you will not associate with these nations which remain among you, or mention the name of their gods, or make anyone swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. But you are to cling to the Lord, your God, as you have done to this day. For the Lord has driven out great and strong nations from before you. And as for you, no man has stood before you to this day. For one of your men puts to flight 1,000. For the Lord your God is he who fights for you, just as he promised you. So take diligent heed to yourselves to love the Lord your God." So as we look at this passage here, again, Joshua is saying, here's what God's going to do next. He's already said, here's how we got to where we're at now. Here's what God has already done. Now here's what God's going to do next. Okay? So what's God going to do next? Well, again, since there were still some of these pagan groups and tribes living still within segments of the promised land, God is telling them, I will continue to drive them out as I had already done to the rest of them, so that they could take full and complete possession of the promised land. But notice verses 6 and 7 that we read. Here's the condition of the conditional promise. All right, he's promised, I will drive them out. But it's an if-then. If you're faithful, then I will drive them out. God says, you must be faithful to me, right? They had made a covenant with God. They needed to fulfill their end of the covenant so that God could keep his end. What did they need to do? Well, verse 6, follow the law of Moses. Verse 7, don't worship idols. Not too complicated. Pretty straightforward. What it was they were expected to do. They were required to remain obedient to God and not worship the false gods of the pagans, right? So all these nations that were around them and those remnants of the pagan tribes that were living within their land, they all worshipped false gods. And God wanted to drive them out and eradicate that evil influence from among them so that they wouldn't be taken in by it and caused to worship a false god. God says that he's already driven out the majority of the strongest people. He's already fulfilled the vast majority of his promise. Verse 10. So what is he asking of them? What's the rest? Well, verse 11 says, so take diligent heed to yourselves to love the Lord your God. What is God asking of his people? As we talked about this morning, love him. Show him that you love him by being obedient to him. That was the requirement. That was the condition of God's conditional promise. Was he asking them to jump through flaming hoops? No. Love me. Love me enough to obey me. Love me enough to be faithful to me. Is that an unreasonable request? Often throughout the Scriptures, God compares his relationship to Israel to that of a husband and a wife. Is it unreasonable for a husband or a wife to say to their spouse, love me and be faithful to me? Is that unreasonable? No. That's the promise you made on the day you were married, right? So is it unreasonable for God to say to the people of Israel, be faithful to me, love me the way you promised to, keep the covenant that you made with me? No. It wasn't unreasonable. It wasn't too much. It wasn't beyond their ability. He was simply asking them to do as they had promised, so he could do as he had promised, because it was a conditional promise. He tells them plainly to worship a false god. What else could you say? But it showed a severe lack of love for him and for the promise that they had made. God had blessed them so much. He had brought them up out of Egypt. He had cared for them for 40 years in the wilderness. He had brought them into the land of Canaan and given them a good land, a land flowing with milk and honey. No, Michael, you're not going to say it? Never mind. There's the VeggieTales line. Every time they say land flowing with milk and honey, one of the grapes will say, that sounds sticky.
I think it was the pear.
It doesn't. The point of the matter is, God had given them a good land. He blessed them tremendously. And all he was asking in return was for them to keep their promise, to be faithful, to love him as they had said they would, to follow him. And so then we see the condition of the conditional promise and what the future that God wanted to give to them hinged upon whether or not they would be faithful. But as we said, God doesn't just give one half of it. He tells them both sides. If you are faithful, right, God's going to continue to drive out the Canaanites. He's going to give you this full land. He's going to make it possible for you to live in prosperity in this good and bountiful land. But here's the other side. Here's the other side of the if-then. Here's the other side of the conditional promise, the warning of what would happen if they were not faithful. Finish the chapter with me, beginning in verse 12. Joshua chapter 23, beginning in verse 12, we read this. For if you ever go back and cling to the rest of these nations, these which remain among you, and intermarry with them, so that you associate with them and they with you, know that with certainty that the Lord your God will not continue to drive these nations out from before you, but they will be a snare and a trap to you, and a whip to your sides, and thorns to your eyes, until you perish off this good land which the Lord your God has given you. Now behold, Joshua said to them, today I am going the way of all the earth. In other words, Joshua is getting old. He's going to pass away. He's not going to be there to guide and lead them anymore. And you know in all your hearts and in all your souls that not one word of all the good words which the Lord your God spoke concerning you has failed. All have been fulfilled for you. Not one of them has failed. It shall come about that just as all the good words which the Lord your God spoke to you have come upon you, so the Lord will bring upon you all the threats until he has destroyed you from off this good land which the Lord your God has given you, when you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them. Then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and you will perish quickly off the good land which he has given you. Do you think they were confused? Do you think they didn't know what God expected of them or what the consequences would be? No. God spelled it out just as clear as day, didn't he? He told them exactly what was going to happen. He made it very plain. God told the Israelites, if they rebelled against him, if they broke the covenant that they had made with him, well, then he would not drive out the rest of the Canaanites from within their land. He tells them that he would allow those Canaanites to remain in the land, and those people would influence the Israelites to sin by encouraging them to worship their false gods, turn away from the Lord. If you've studied the rest of the Old Testament, and I know that you have, you already know what happens. It begins to happen as soon as Joshua passes away. As you turn the page from Joshua 24 to Judges 1, what happens? You see the people turn away from God and begin to worship false gods. As soon as Joshua gave them this warning, as soon as Joshua and the other leaders from that generation had passed away, the next generation immediately began to do precisely what Joshua warned them not to do. They begin to worship false gods. And we see the terrible cycle of the book of Judges of sin and the consequences thereof. But my point to you is it shouldn't have been that way. It didn't have to be that way. They certainly had every reason to trust God. They certainly had every reason to know what was right and what was wrong, what the benefits were of following God, what the consequences were of disobeying God. These things were plain and known. So the question then is why? Well, as is often the case, the answers are sometimes harder to discern than the questions. Why did they fall away? Why were they unfaithful? Why did they disobey the Lord? It wasn't one thing. They were influenced by the nations around them that they didn't dispossess as God told them to. They were influenced by Satan leading them astray. They were influenced by their own carnal desires. And probably several other things that I'm not thinking of right now. But the point of the matter is they were led astray. And they turned away from God. And this ultimately, as God warned them about, would lead to them being essentially evicted. Right? So as we think about the land of Canaan, I liken it to if you own a house and you rent it out to somebody and they don't keep their end of the lease agreement, what do? You evict them. You evict them according to the stipulations in the lease agreement that they signed. That's precisely what happened with the people of Israel here. They signed a lease agreement essentially with God to live in his land. And when they didn't do what he said, he sent them out. Right? The northern tribes of Israel were sent away into Assyrian captivity, never to return. The southern kingdom of Judah was sent away into Babylonian captivity, where they suffered for 70 years until God let them return. And so when we look at this reality here, what we see, again, is this simple point. They had absolutely no reason to doubt God's promises. They had absolutely no reason to doubt God's promises because he had already done everything that he had promised. Again, go back to verse 14 that we read. Joshua 23, verse 14, he says, not one word of the good words which the Lord your God spoke concerning you has failed. All have been fulfilled for you. Not one has failed. God has done exactly what he said. He's proven himself to be worthy of our trust by keeping his promises. Joshua had already said something very similar to that at the end of chapter 21. Chapter 21 and verse 45 says, not one of the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass. He's reminding them again and again and again of the trustworthiness of God. That God keeps his promises. That God does what he says. And as we read from verses 15 and 16, God gave them a very stern warning of what would happen if they were disobedient. They would lose possession of the promised land. They would be evicted. And so as we think about this chapter, we think about the very concept that we're that we're seeing played out here before us, this idea of God making conditional promises. And we know, of course, that God was making that promise to the people of Israel. They would have that land that God had blessed them with, that good land that he had given to them as long as they were faithful. That was the conditional promise that God made to them. We, of course, today live under a different covenant, don't we? We don't live under the covenant of Israel. We don't follow the Ten Commandments that God gave to them at Mount Sinai. We have a new covenant. A new covenant given to us through Jesus Christ. But what's funny is, for all the things that are different, there's so many things that are the same. There's so many things that haven't changed from Joshua's day till now. You might remember the famous charge that Joshua gave to the people of Israel in the next chapter. Look at Joshua chapter 24. Look at verses 14 and 15. Joshua chapter 24, verses 14 and 15. Joshua said, "Now therefore fear the Lord, and serve him in sincerity and truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river," the Euphrates River. We're talking about Abraham and his forefathers, which your fathers served beyond the river, and in Egypt. Right? So they had just come out of Egypt, and they had learned idolatry down there from the Egyptians. He says, turn away from those gods. Don't follow them anymore. He says, instead, serve the Lord. And then verse 15, he says, if it's disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So Joshua is saying to them, you get to pick. There's lots of gods out there that you can worship if you want to. But he had already said all the things that we've talked about before he gave them that. Showing them which one they ought to be following. But he says, you've got to make a decision. Who are you going to serve? Are you going to follow the God who's blessed you, the God who's shown himself to be worthy of your trust, the God who keeps his promises? Or are you going to worship a lump of stone, an idol carved out of wood by the working of some man's hands? Or are you going to worship the one and only true God? You can't do both. You've got to choose. And again, I suggest to you that even though we live under a different covenant today, and there's no longer this promise of the land of Canaan that we will forfeit if we're disobedient to God, instead, we have a very similar promise, conditional promise. The New Testament tells us that if we are unfaithful to God as Christians, we will forfeit not the land of Canaan, but the eternal home in heaven that he has prepared for us. And so we must not make the same mistake that the Israelites made. We must not refuse to follow the will of God that he has given to us in the New Testament. The New Testament tells us plainly that we have essentially the same choice that Joshua presented to them. We can serve sin and receive the end result thereof, death. Or we can serve God and receive the reward of eternal life. It's basically the same options that Joshua gave to the people all those many, many years ago. They still exist for you and I. Here we are, a covenant people of God, just the same as they were a covenant people of God. And we have today the same promise of blessings and warning of consequences that Joshua gave to them all those many years ago. Not much has changed. But what we have in the promise of Jesus Christ is even greater than the promise of the land of Canaan that was given to them. And as foolish and as silly as it was for them to disobey God and to give up that home that God had blessed them with, it would be far, far worse for us to turn away from God and to serve Satan and to give up that home in heaven for eternity that he has prepared for us. Maybe there's one here who needs to respond to his invitation to put on Christ in baptism, that you can have that promise. that hope of heaven. Maybe you're already a Christian, but you realize that you've not been faithful. If there's something we can do to help you, won't you please come as we stand and as we sing.